Relax. Z.
And I am Kirsten, and we are your hosts for today.
Welcome to the fourth day of the Institute for Nationalist Studies' first anniversary special. Today's forum is entitled Terra Incognita, the Geography of Imperialism, brought to you by the Institute for Nationalist Studies, along with Rise for Education Kisai, Rise for Education Alliance Tarlac, Concerned Students for Justice and Peace Metro Manila, and National Union of Students in the Philippines.
But before we formally begin, here are a few reminders for our event. Please keep your camera and mic closed at all times unless you are requested to do so by the speakers, the host, or anyone from the production team. Please do not record in video or audio any part of the event to respect the speakers and other participants in their privacy. Please do not take screenshots of any segment of the event. And lastly, there will be an open forum after the second speaker. You may reserve your questions until then, or you may send your questions and comments in the chat box or in the live stream. You may also use our hashtag 1NS to share your thoughts and comments across different social media platforms.
For a short description of today's event, Terra Incognita is a Latin term that means unknown land. This reflects the political power of maps and mapping. Today, we will be focusing on a series of keynote lectures that discusses the effects of imperialism on spaces and their study, or the usage of geography to bring awareness and resist imperialism. Kirsten, are you ready for what's in store?
Of course, Z. Personally, as an aspiring geographer myself, this forum is something I really look forward to. And our speakers today are not only researchers and not the scholars who do research from an ivory tower, but rather researchers who truly integrate with the people and make maps from below. Now, without any further ado, let us formally begin with the first part of our program. So our first speaker is a faculty from the Department of Geography of the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and an affiliate professor at the UP Center for International Studies. He is currently the director of the UP Third World Study Center and leads the Mapping Geo Narratives project. He is an active member of the Philippine Geographical Society and the American Association of Geographers. So today's talk, entitled The Map is Never the Territory, Stories of Radical and Dissident Geographies, will present various cultures of mapping and will focus on counter-cartography as a movement to redress the often white and colonialist geo-visualization of the world. It will show various examples and case studies where mapping and map-making practices create new ways of visualizing local communities and regions at various scales. Now let us welcome Dr. Joseph Palis, and please give him a virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share with you about some of the things that I've been involved with, not only in research, but also in teaching. And I'm so thrilled that I'll be in the same bill with my very good friend, Dr. Linda Kikiviks, who is a good and dear friend of mine from graduate school. And I can't wait to listen to her presentation as well. So let me begin by, and how much time do I have? You're just going to give me a signal, right? It might go beyond, just in case it goes beyond 30, just give me a sign so I can edit it. So the title of my presentation is called The Map is Never the Territory, Stories of Radical and Dissident Geographies. And this reflection came about through my own research in the Geo Narratives project, which I headed since 2019. And still ongoing despite the pandemic, and also because of my own teaching. I've been teaching a class called Cultures of Mapping and Counter-Cartography in the last 5 years, ever since I went back to the Philippines in 2015. And of course, once again, my colleague, Dr. Kikiviks, and I shared this particular passion. We were in grad school in North Carolina. So let me begin by showing you this particular map here, which I'm going to discuss much later on. It's a map done by the Lumad K-12 students in order to create their own world. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So my name is Joseph Palis. I'm from UP Diliman, associate professor and incoming chair of the Department of Geography, and also currently the last few days of my directorship at the Third World Study Center. Okay, so thank you very much once again to INS for this invitation. You may be wondering, or maybe not, you may be wondering why the title is Never the Territory. I use that, hold on, excuse me. I can't move, I can't seem to move my presentation. Sorry about this. Of course, it had to happen, right? It had to happen when I give a speech, and then this particular thing happens. Geez, what do I do? I can't seem to move this. Anyway, well, I can't speak. Could you please stop share me for a minute? I'm just gonna, if you can do that, or I'm the one who should be doing that. I apologize for this technical issue. It never happened, but it can happen. Okay. All right. Okay. Are you seeing this now? Are you seeing
right.
it?
No, not yet, sir.
Yeah. Okay. What about this? Are you? Um.
Not yet, sir.
I
Oh,
do need to share screen. I'm really sorry about this.
it's
Like I
okay
said,
po.
what about this one?
Yes,
Works?
sir. It
Let me
works
see if
po.
I'm gonna make this full screen mine. I apologize for taking 2 minutes of that. Oh, there you go. Okay,
It's okay.
you may. Thank you, thank you, Kirsten. The title, which is the map is never the territory, came from. Uh, oh my goodness, it's not moving again. There's a conspiracy, an imperialist conspiracy to not make me speak about counter cartography. Sorry, one last time, gonna, if you can just stop share me, and then I will not use the entire page this time. Okay, and then I'll just share. I'm sorry, I don't know why. Okay, let me just show it this way. Is that okay? It's it's not the best, but it will probably do for now. So the title of my presentation was "The Map is Never the Territory" because it came from the French theorist, philosopher, and sociologist Jean Baudrillard, who gave us this term: "The map precedes the territory." So basically, what it's trying to say is. Usually the map becomes the representation, right? The representation that covers the world. In my research with my former advisor Scott Kirsch, who came here to do research about early colonial maps in the Philippines, we found out that ever since the Americans started giving us the map of the Philippines that we know now, people started thinking of that as the map of the Philippines. It's just like the profile of Jesus Christ, right? That picture of Jesus Christ with a profile of kind of smooth skin, longish hair with beard, became the basis for the Jesus Christ. And as Kiki will tell you later on, maybe not in the presentation, Jesus Christ, if he, she, they, it is real, might be living in Palestine and may not have that skin or complexion because of the amount of work that he does or he did. Anyway, so this became the process wherein the map became that replaces what we know the world to be. Just like some of you who are driving, you may use your Waze much more than the full engagement with the environment. So parang yun sigurong gustong paita. So and that is because we are now attuned towards the culture of map making, right? So I'm gonna deconstruct that later on and tell you about certain kinds of movements. But first of all, here's the how I plan to make this presentation. Just gonna talk really quick about counter mapping, which might dovetail pretty well to what Dr. Kikiviks will do, and then what it does primarily my examples might not be necessarily in the Philippines, but I'm going to show you, especially in the third part, Geo Narratives happening in the Philippines, also based on my own research. But this is pretty much a kind of introduction to counter cartography. If some of you are encountering this for the first time and learning much about it, it's a very wonderful and fertile field of activism and subversion to the state. And finally, well, I don't have reflections because the reflections will come while I show you this map, right? So let me first go to counter cartographies. First, when we do the map, the geovisualization, when I was younger, and when I went to school here in the Philippines, when I was in my high school, I remember taking the ROTC, or we call it here ROTC, but you probably haven't heard of it anymore because it's not being taught. But I remember our platoon commander telling us that the map is a graphical representation of the Earth. So we never questioned that. We never thought that it could be otherwise. It can be performative. It can be indigenous. It can be bioregional. You can dance. You can make a song, and that is still mapping. Even a film can be a form of map that engages you about certain kinds of issues that are happening, what you see on screen, right? But one in particular, J.B. Harley, the late great John Brian Harley, who passed away in 2001, has said that maps are preeminently a language of power. So when I create a map, for example, that becomes the official story, pretty much, right? And counter cartography is quite different from that, and it's about redressing, as what was mentioned earlier, redressing what was perpetuated by the status quo. And John Krieger and Dennis Wood in particular also mentioned that maps are propositions in graphic form. Propositions because if I make a map and I show it to you all, it is my way of convincing you or persuading you about the stuff I wanted to talk about, right? So it becomes that kind of articulation. But it was actually Nancy Lee Peluso in 1995 who actually first came up with the term counter mapping when she did her research in Kalimantan in Indonesia, where she basically said, among many things, wonderful things that she said about the counter map is supposed to be, a kind of a non-official but just as accurate and authentic representation of the people's lands, right? She basically said to capture the distinctiveness of contemporary third world mapping politics, right? Because most of the mapping practices are mostly from the white colonialist perspective. And when they are being done in other countries, especially including the Philippines and other global South countries, they also imitate and copy the ones that are being there, not realizing that they could really produce their own map as well. Sorry, it's too wordy. There will be two more slides about words, but other than that, they're mostly visuals. Maps are really tools for engagement, and so in a sense, it is about how we look at the land tenure problems, poverty, dispossession by accumulation, or the other way around, accumulation by dispossession and alienation and all kinds of things. And it has been, as a geographer, I never realized this actually. I'm gonna confess to you that when it's only when I went to grad school that I realized that geography is a discipline of colonization and imperialism, where mostly Europeans would go to the New World, right? I have to use the air quotes because that's pretty much how they look at us. Pretty much the Terra Incognita that Kirsten has mentioned earlier. Is a way of mapping the world, but also ostensibly also gather and extract resources, pretty much from these areas, right? So and geography has been legitimizing and authenticating that kind of practice as real, right? So in a sense, it's interesting because Dr. Kathy Gibson from Western Australia, who by the way wrote this feminist manifesto about capitalism in her book with called J.K. Gibson Graham, has said why don't we take a look at some of the early works of geographers in the Philippines? And when we gathered most of those books, we were so horrified to realize that most of the writings, especially after World War II of the Philippines, was about economic geography. Nothing wrong with economic geography, except when it is about looking at extractivist politics of just getting the resources. So there's a problem there. But we didn't realize it then, right? The decolonization, most of the liberation movements, as well as decolonization that started much earlier, of course, but really reached its apex in the 1960s, became the basis for a way of countering these narratives, right? So in a sense, it's really giving us a tool for many of us to create maps to represent our own world. Now, let me show you, this will be a series of photos, both international and local, mostly international. So this is pretty much just this. Now, you may probably have heard of Kurti, this kid who died as a refugee, right, going to Europe. And that's exactly the picture when he was found dead in the shores. And that picture became the basis for the artist to actually show a map of the world that excludes all kinds of refugees. So, I mean, it's easy for us to see with this kind of representation that the world is actually closing its doors towards people they feel are really just going to mess up their population. They think it will take away the jobs, and mostly because they think of these people as not within their peer, which of course is pretty much what Edward Said said in his pioneering book Orientalism, wherein Orientalism is a product of it's an invention of Europe in order to separate the us and the them, right? I mean, why can't we call it? Why do we have to call the continent of Europe Europe when we can just call it Eurasia, right? It's just one big continent. It's the othering, the other primitive people there in the east, and we, the more progressive people, or the more affluent societies there. And then, okay. And of course, there are certain kinds of maps as well that poke at our funny bone, so to speak, right? Examples of which are how the economic dominance and hegemonic power of the United States would want to rearrange or reconfigure the world map, pretty much, right? So this is how they look at it in order to drumbeat the FTA, the free trade agreement. So let me show you, and there are actually several photos here, and this is the part where I wish I could show you the I don't know why it's working this way, but this is the part where it actually has a lot of layers of maps, and I can't show them right now if I'm just doing it this way. Why don't I try again? And I'm sorry, I'm so sorry if it's just going to mess up the schedule, but okay. So here's okay, finally worked. So here's an example of your drone picture, right? Many of us love this, but it's also a tool for spying, as well as looking at the information of other people and properties. But they're packaged as touristic kinds of tools in order for us to appreciate the beauty rather than the politics behind each of these pictures. Wow, the beautiful island. I was, interestingly enough, this past semester, I was teaching a class called Island and Archipelagic Studies. And the students never realized that the point to understand island and archipelagos is not those configurations of islands, but the sea, the ocean. To understand it is to go submarine, below what's in it, and see the relationship that comes with it. It's very interesting stuff, the way the Europeans made us think of the islands as the only one, And then of course pictures like this also that show us supposedly the aesthetic part of it, but of course underlaying it is really much surveillance and spying, right? This was a picture in Spain about pretty much George Orwell's Big Brother, right? You're being watched. There are also examples of electoral maps, and I'm sorry if I have to use a not so updated map on this, but if you look at the election before the Trump-Biden one, this was the Hillary Clinton-Trump one. And I got this online. It shows you that the red state are those who are conservatives, right? And you could see pretty much that Trump should be the president of the United States by virtue of how these maps look. You know, when you think about this. But Hillary Clinton actually won more popular votes than Trump. So what made him become president? When you look at the map this way, it misleads you. It lies. But if you look at the map, and of course, mine is not moving anymore. Really, there's a conspiracy. I'm so sorry. Sorry. I'm really sorry about this. It's supposed to work. Oh, there you go. So this is the card, a map that shows you if population is instead used to represent votes, right? So makikita nyo talaga, no, na talagang mas sa gitna lang o sa heartland ng Amerika lang ang nagbumoboto sa conservative, no? Pero East Coast, West Coast pretty much may mga ganun. Pero ang mapa palagi pinapakita sa atin the other one, right? So, right. And then there's also indigenous mapping that tells us, this is a map. Why don't you not call this a map? Because we're always taught that a map should look like what it should be, the topographic map. But this is a medieval map in Italy, actually, that shows you where people go and frequent more, right? Even the writings on the wall, right, of early drawings are examples of how people were already telling stories about their world. And these are not always categorized as maps, but seen as just aesthetic things, right? Because we discovered them, right? And of course, cases were in indigenous mapping in Canada, the First Nations, for example, a mapping of how snow is prevalent, right? 50 different names for snow, pretty much, because that's the environment that which to show them. And of course, I know this is really blurred from your screen if you're watching this, but I got this online, which is an early map in Spain that showed you engagement of the people towards what they consider as important to them. What about hand-drawn maps? Can you not call them maps just because they are not technically precise or doesn't have cardinal points? Let me just warn you for a minute, by the way. I might just disappear because of power outage, because where I am right now, it's raining hard. So I'm just going to cover as much ground. I'm really sorry about both the technical and climatic issues. Like, for example, this one, it's a picture of a map that was done by a homeless person. As someone who worked with a homeless shelter in Chapel Hill, where Kiki and I went to school, I actually was reminded by one of those homeless people that you shouldn't call them homeless, because the term homeless is a very neoliberal definition that tells you about who has home, who doesn't. To them, they live on the outside. They live on the outside. So therefore, it changes the way you look at the public sphere all of a sudden, right? You have no home, then my home is the outside. And now you'd round me up because I'm a vagrant, you know? So it tells you about the kind of orientation we also have, you know, in this way. And of course, Annika, she's 4 years old when she did this, but this is a hand-drawn map of a 4-year, oh, she's 11 years old now, but when she did this, when she was asked to create her own map, it's very telling that she only drew the maps that the places that are important to her. Art map, why not? All right. Let's start with the one in 1929, the world according to the Surrealists. And if you notice here, notice how the US is not given as much importance. Alaska maybe, yes, but Alaska's not joined the Union by then. It joined in, oh, wait a minute, they already did, 1912, take it back. But this was 1929, right? But it shows you a more global South kind of connections in some sense. And then, of course, Max Ernst did this as a Europe to show desolation and devastation. And the year was 1933, which is, of course, the year that Hitler also ascended into power, which later on reconfigured much of the European cartographies that we have. But it already shows you the effects of human intervention towards discriminating other people who they think that belong to the Aryan race. And of course, this is done by friends of ours in grad school. This became in a sense, became the the template for most of the other counter cartography maps that have been done. If I may just mention their names, these are colleagues of ours: Liz Mason Dees, Craig Dalton, Tim Stallman, Sebastian Covarrubias, and Maribel Casas Cortez were behind the creation of this map. This is the map of our school, which is the oldest state university in the United States. But if you look closely at the maps, you can't see it right now, but if you look closely at the map, if you have a copy of this, maybe online it's there, you will see that it's not just a tourist map of the campus, but it's telling you about discrimination, about the marginalization of janitors, or as it's called in the States, housekeepers, and the wages, the imbalances, the disparities. Quite a different kind of narrative, right? The counter narrative that's being given, especially when you're trying to push through your school and say, hey, come here, first year people, why don't you just come to our school? We have X, Y, and Z amenities. But rather than showing them instead what's the reality. I like this map by Ellen O'Hara. If you look at the one on top, it says World Map Protesting Cartography. Places the United States has bombed since from 1854 ongoing. I like that it's a little bit ongoing because it's not complete. The US is such a hegemonic power that keeps on, under the name of world order, has been really pillaging and invading other areas. But how do we really convey knowledge through this, no? And our very good friend, Kiki and I, good friend Dennis Wood, has made a lot of these counter maps since the 1960s and 70s of his neighborhood in North Carolina, in Raleigh, especially Boylan Heights. This may not be as radical, but imagine this is the first of its kind, creating a map that tells a story rather than a much more technically precise kind of maps. This is Dennis Wood. Who, by the way, celebrated his birthday yesterday. But this is the picture of Boylan Heights, according to house number, right? So it actually also resembles a heart. I'm not sure if you're seeing it or I'm just seeing it, but it kind of looks like a heart a little bit, right? And then this is the map that became sort of emblematic of what he does. These are jack-o'-lanterns and Halloween, but it tells you that this is pretty much the same map that you saw earlier, except that the jack-o'-lanterns are raised. Now, you may think of this as, okay, pretty, maybe interesting, but what does it really do, right? What it does is it shows you the areas that would have jack-o'-lanterns as emblematic of income, and also where the people would most likely create this as a sign of their own material power over the others, right? And also tells you about security and protection. The more illumination, the more light, the more likely it is much more affluent. And this is according to Thatched Roof, This is before the age of data privacy, right? But what he does is he would go to some of the streets and ask if your roofs are actually double thatched or not, right? Probably not something most of you would spend doing, but it's very interesting to show you maps that show you features you don't necessarily see. Chimes, again, just artistically done, where the more chimes, probably tells you about the geographic location that favors more wind, so that the chime will sound much better than the others. This is just a coverage of how the radio. This is before satellite radio, right? So this is a very analog kind of era. And these are actually barking dogs, right? It shows you about where maps are. So it involves going towards areas and asking people pets, again, before the Data Privacy Act. But this is, again, telling you also about the kind of protection that most Americans would rather have in their homes by having dogs. But I like to show you this one in particular. This came from the movie called La Haine by Matthew Kasovitz. And this is a group of 3 guys, right? Arab, Muslim, and Jew, right? They're friends. They were born in Paris, but they were always seen as foreigners because of their identity politics, their subjectivity. There was this one scene here where they saw this picture of the one that says the world is yours, right? Le monde est vous. And then one of them changed the V to an N. The world is ours. It's a way of reclaiming space that has not happened before by vandalizing public sphere and make it their own. I know we're excluded in this society because we are always seen as Arabs and Muslims and Jews. But why don't for a moment show us that this is our world too, right? And this is what I think is what imbues this this scene so beautifully, in my opinion. Do watch for that film if you get a chance to see it. And actually, I'm going to show you one quick one. This is from the Library of Congress, and this was done by Thomas Edison in 1899. And it shows you the early Filipinos, right? I'm just going to show you this, just so you would. Oh, didn't show. Of course, it will not show. But that picture, by the way, that I'm about to tell you, that would have been is a map that shows is a film that shows you the Filipinos fighting against the Americans, right? And then, of course, it's reenacted. And then it will show you in the end that we will die in the trenches. We're being shot at and we die. The Americans come in and wave the flag. But here's the interesting part. The Filipinos there were portrayed by African American soldiers from New Jersey because they could not find Filipinos at the time to do that. Very interesting, no? The earliest depiction of Filipinos on screen were African Americans and not Filipinos. Now we go to the Geo Narratives, and I'm sorry if this come out. Okay, the Geo Narratives is the project I'm doing. Bell, for example, calls Geo Narratives as meaningful place experience, while Mipo Kwan and her students said interpretation of oral and life. I call it in the publication that's going to come out later this year as place writing, right? That define and rewrite and imagine a place. And if you look at that map right now, you will see that it is done by a person with disability, PWD as we call it here, or differently abled person who was drawing his map of UP Diliman in relation to disaster. Of course, as a PWD, he always had to worry about where to run if there is such a calamitous event. Okay. And then here's an example too of the Lumad map that was done in 2019, where we asked them to create their own world. But what is interesting about this map, in my opinion, is the fact that if you see the name Philemon there, it is an ongoing map. It's not a still map. It's not still life or anything. It's actually a map that shows you movement of Philemon, who has to do certain kinds of movements you can see from the arrow right there. And then he had to transgress the grounds, right, in order to do what he plans to do. But I find this interesting because when the K-12 students, Lumad students who came here in UP Diliman to draw these maps were actually talking about that proudly as a way of transgressing space also, right? And in this particular one, this is the part that's a little bit more heartbreaking because of the fact that when they create their own world of city of where they are in Mindanao, there is the military presence, as you can see from that map right there on the right with soldiers. And they have no concept of monsters or aswang or gulls, but they call them busao. And when I asked them what busao means, they said those people. It's very interesting how life worlds create new sets of legends, so to speak, right, in their own way. And in the folklore, they harass, they intimidate. It pretty much captures that too. We did one more geo-narrative, and this one, a professor, a retired professor from UP Diliman in psychology, drew her map in order to show what the first quarter storm map looks like. But interestingly, it doesn't show much. If you look at it for the first time, it actually shows you that on the very, from where you are right now, on the left-hand corner, on the very, my left-hand corner, of course, when you look at this, but on the lower end, that's where she lives. For those of you from UP here, you may know the Ilang-Ilang Residence Hall. She had to traverse the academic oval at the time in order to protest. So remember, the first quarter storm was also about trying to prevent the military from entering campus, which of course, how many years? 40 years later, happened again in UP Diliman, right? But that's how it is, in remembering what the campus looks like. And this was, of course, where the students were much more engaged, right? This is, of course, for the pandemic. I'd like to include this one. This may be a little bit outside that sphere, but this breaks my heart because when this was done among the mappings of home, right, by one of my students, Joey Peralta, who's an MS Geography student, she did this for data gathering. She was asking the elderly, the people who are, we call this in the Philippines, home for the aged. In the US, we call it home, right? But here, these were abandoned elderly or older adults. And when she was asked to draw her house, she could not do it. If you see the three drawings there on the left, letter H, it looks like letter H, just because she cannot draw it successfully until she sort of succeeded in the fourth one, right? I mean, home is so disrupted. Extreme geographies of home can also manifest. So when we talk about imperialism, when we talk about these kinds of colonialist discourse, there's also one that's a violent one that's happening in the intimate spaces of our home too. And some of them would also talk about if they have an imagined home, it would look like this, right? Where there would be lots of people, there would be fruits and vegetables surrounded by it, right? So, and then I'm going to show you two more maps before we move on to the other one. But what happened when people are quarantined during the pandemic period? And this is where people from Bulacan did their own version of it. Now it only becomes well, I don't want to say interesting map necessarily, but it comes with a geo narrative. They have to tell the stories for the map to come together. So that's when we put caption for this map. But what she did was to show you what the lay of the land looks like from her side and how they had to escape in terms of flood, right? So interesting too. If you notice the picture of the house, you would see the one, can you see the arrows from both sides? That's the level of water that comes in, right? So she had to draw it in order to show you different ways with which their home units are compromised during the flood prone area, during flood and calamities, right? So it's a way of visualizing our world too, because of the ineptitude of most of our local government units in providing decent housing to people who live in precarious or environmentally fragile areas, right? And then we also have certain kinds of creative cartographies, and one artist in particular by the name of Sian Dairit has done so much wonderful stuff since, right? This one, the Philippine Islands, he calls this objects of colonial desire by subverting the island and making it upside down. That makes us have a different cartographic imagination of the Philippines. What if it looks like this for real, right? Luzon is actually in the southern part. But also it's because of the perpetuation of much of the colonial maps that were done in the past, right? So it's his way of actually queering the map. By the word queer here, it doesn't just refer to the LGBTQ, but to disrupt heteronormativism by creating a map that is just as true for people who experience it in these particular ways. Orbis de las Islas Filipinas can be another one too, right? That shows you how he views the map from the perspective of those people who are in areas where the resources are much more important than the people themselves, or creating maps that adhere to the language of a kind of portraiture, pretty much in evidence during the Enlightenment period, right? So, but again, if you look at the map closely, there's subtle figures of subversion as well, in terms of it looks beautiful from this sense, but it looks at the industries also that reconfigure the landscape of the land, as well as other kinds of maps that I may not have time to actually discuss, but to show you that maps could also be experienced very differently from the artist's perspective, and show you a different way of how they look at the Philippines in terms of in lenses of capitalism and colonialism, right? So if arc of instability, I like that. Usually we use different kinds of geologic terms, right? But here it shows you instability, and it's a double meaning because of how the world reconfigured that all those in the south, or those in the so-called tropical countries, are the ones who suffer the most because of resources being abundant, but also prone to extractivist politics. And also a map that he did in the Lopez Museum, wherein you could touch it, you could really do this. Yes, Therese, are you raising your hand, or my time is coming short? Just tell me. Okay. so these are examples of maps also that show you the sugar industry. I'm just gonna run through it. But there's another artist actually by the name of Mark Salvatus who did this urban mountains, and it's not doing it right now. But Mark Salvatus is actually showing a video. If you can see this one, it's we call it in the Philippines flyover, right? But they look like mountains, really. You have to traverse the one in Camias, for example, that you see. That's a really steep flyover there that people had to climb. So you see the kind of thing he was raising here is that people are not given the kind of attention, but instead the cars are the one given certain kinds of attention because they're given the road, whereas we, you, me, everyone else had to go through these flyovers in order not to disrupt the the flow of the cars, right? He also did these kinds of things as a way of tourists. They called them territories because the world or the Philippine urban areas are now riddled with these buildings and skyscrapers. Now, moving on to this one, there are also community mappings that are being done. Again, this is from the Lumad perspective. And the one that I showed you earlier, which shows you the Busao, right? Okay. Now, here's another kind of map that was done by the Junior Philippine Geographical Society, wherein they did some kind of geo-narrative mapping of Hacienda Luisita. A little bit controversial this time because they went there and interviewed the people, and here's what they come up with. It's pretty much like the Counter Cartography Collective that you saw earlier. They showed you instead the marginalization of the people. So based on their own perspective, this is what it looks like, right? This was, by the way, about 4 years, 5 years ago, right? Land grabbing is going on, bulldozer, idle lands. And this is the actual hectareage that they feel actually bring it to Hacienda Luisita, which you compare it to Manila and Makati, is close to the combined cities of Manila and Makati. So what does it tell us about certain kinds of power that come with the use of these lands? So maybe in retrospect, right, what does the map really do to us too? When we go beyond the map as not just the representation, but could also be films, art maps, or hand-drawn maps, I would like to end, rather, maybe it's a negative kind of vibe, but deathscapes, right? With apologies to Don Mitchell, who first used this term. Cian Dairit once again created this piece of the Philippine map enclosed in an encasement that looks like a kind of a burial, right? Because this lupang hinulid, he calls it, which is, of course, laying to rest the Philippine archipelago because of so much a dispossession that has been happening in our country. Rather close up with this, and of course this picture that became iconic in the Philippines about the war on drugs by President Duterte, who delivered his last State of the Nation address yesterday. I won't comment on it, but the vigilantism in the Philippines also that resulted to the killing of people who were suspected or rather placed in the drug watch, right? But this is what looks like also the spectacularization of the site that made people take pictures of it as though it is some kind of a zoo or object of. And of course, there are also cases of like this, as Third World Studies Director here, we also document the killings that are happening even during the pandemic period. And of course, I'm just going to tease you with this, but also this 9-dash line that's also creating certain kind of geopolitical tension with China, right? So it's going to be interesting what's going to happen in the next few months or beyond, right? As we navigate through geopolitical things with China. I like to end with a poem by Nobel Prize winner Wisława Szymborska, where she said, "I like maps because they lie, because they give no access to the vicious truth, because great-heartedly, good-naturedly, they spread before me a world, not of this world." Pretty much just like what Baudrillard said. In a sense, the map doesn't really capture the living conditions of the people, everything else that are happening, the dispossession, the sadness, the pain, the emotional geographies that come with it, because the maps do that. But there might be a way to actually look at counter cartography as an attempt to provide stories of people who were marginalized by the system, by the institutions, and the powerful elite our country, of the Asian region, as well as of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joseph Palis, for that very interesting discussion. I really appreciated the bit on the disruption of heteronormativity, as it allows the Filipino to have an alternative perception of the Philippines, and uh, the, we would see how the Philippines would look if we weren't colonized. How about you, Kirsten?
Honestly, I really have a lot on my mind. It's quite hard to synthesize my ideas because I learned a lot. But one thing that struck me most was the bit about the neoliberal term of homelessness. Like it really stuck with me because it stresses the importance of involving these people in discussions and methodologies, and that we have to realize that our perspectives are limited because we're not directly experiencing the concrete conditions of these people. And various groups view the world differently. Like a woman may have a different perception of a certain street, a certain group might have a different perception of a certain space, and some spaces might be accessible to a certain class only. And therefore, if we fail to involve these people in this mapping and these methodologies, we're kind of dislodging them from their own narrative, sort of like the original colonial orientation of map making, and hence it stresses the importance of counter cartography that involves the narratives of the people on the ground themselves. So again, thank you very much for that very, very insightful talk. And to the audience, I've been seeing a lot of manifestations and comments, and we will get back to the questions later on. But for manifestations, do you see any comments here? Okay.
There's one from Glenn. Hi, Glenn. It's so wonderful to see you here. Glenn asked me this question. You mentioned the extractive dimensions of mapping, especially colonialist projects. Can you talk a bit about how mapping and counter mapping can intervene in the relationship between state making and the natural world? Certainly, Glenn. First of all, let me just say this, and this was reinforced by other scholars as well as community workers, that counter mapping is not the answer to everything. And I had to say that because there is a tendency probably for many of us to think of counter mapping as the gospel truth. It's the way out, because if I may just mention this, according to Rob Kitchen and Martin Dodge, they said, or especially Rhiannon Firth, who said this, that critical in most activist mapping, that counter cartography can also be co-opted by the system in order to reinforce and perpetuate certain kinds of exploitative practices. So counter mapping may sometimes be used to say, oh, this was counter map, right? This is a counter map, but it's actually used by institutions. So this question about, can you talk a bit about how mapping and counter mapping can intervene between state making and the natural world? Most certainly, and I think many of us here could become citizen mappers too. I use the word citizen from citizen science, right? We can become volunteers in order to create certain kinds of realities between how our world or landscapes, especially Metro Manila and elsewhere, of course, are being, for example, changed, right? And we show them these kinds of mappings as interventions, right? And we use the social media to do that. I'm actually part of the Facebook group that's called Creative, the Tugon, the creatives were responding towards the pandemic and, of course, state oppression. And also there's this wonderful funny group called Mga Mapang Dito Tanggapin sa social, I forget the title, but these were really citizen science kind of maps that were drawn to show you how people really think about the exploitative nature of the institutions. Now, whether this can be given the importance needed by people who will notice is up in the air. We probably will not be given so much audience by the state in order to show these kinds of what people go through. But at the same time, it's a way of countering the narratives that are being perpetuated by people. So ang dami din kasing issues that can be brought up there, no? Yung for example, yung community pantry, no, na naging politicized na siya, no, kasi it's a very Kropotkin approach of mutual aid, no? Si Peter Kropotkin kasi yung Russian geographer noon, sabi na mundo daw naman natin mutual, no, pero sabi ng iba, hindi, mga komunista kayo, no, and all these things. Pero when you think about these kinds of intervention, meron na talagang ginagawa ang mga tao. So one of my colleagues in the Department of Geography, Professor Oni Martinez, along with her Ministry of Mapping, has actually done mapping of community pantries. It's also a kind of counter mapping because it shows you where they are, so people can go to these places and avail of provisions, you know, and only get what you want, no, rather than getting everything, which is of course greed, you know, in another way. So may thin line din kuminsan, Glenn, no? May thin line din doon kasi kuminsan parang saan na ba talaga ginagamit ng instrumento ng power ang mapping din under the guise of counter map ito, no? So meron din, ang idea lang ay dapat maging vigilant tayo na citizenry para mag-expose, no, sa what we feel are mga panlilin lang, no, and misleading and lies, you know, about this. I can talk more about it, but I don't want to take more time because I'm sure Kiki is going to speak next, and another, and I think David Garcia.
Thank you for the very insightful response, Dr. Palis. The next questions will be reserved for the open forum. Now, before we proceed, let us thank our partner organizations. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Palis. Please, again, to our audience, please feel free to send in your comments or manifestations in the chat box. However, again, please reserve your questions for the open forum later. Thank you. Now, before we proceed, let us thank our partner organization who helped make this event possible. This forum is brought to you by INS, with special thanks to Campus Alliance for Dedicated and Unified Action, UP Baguio, UPLB University Freshman Council, College of Engineering and Agro-Industrial Technology Student Council, Anak Bayan Nueva Ecija, College of Human Ecology Student Council, College of Agriculture and Food Science Student Council, College of Human Ecology Freshman Council, Panday Sining Romblon, College Editors Guild of the Philippines, UPLB College of Development Communication Freshman Council, Likas Bayan, College of Agriculture and Food Science Freshman Council, and the UPLB College of Economics and Management Student Council. Thank you so much for supporting our anniversary special.
So now for the next part of the forum, for our next speaker, Dr. Linda Kikiviks is a popular educator, writer, and translator who has given several talks on various liberation struggles, including that of Zapatista, Palestinian, and Black liberation. She is a geographer by training and is currently writing a book called Palestine 1942. So let us now welcome Dr. Linda Kikiviks, and please give her a warm and virtual round of applause.
Thank you so much for that, for the invitation to be here. I'm so excited to be here with Joseph. As he was speaking, it's early in the morning where I'm at. So I'm currently in Spain, and as he was speaking, I was drinking coffee because I felt like I was back in grad school and we're having these fun conversations again, and we would always drink coffee. So I needed it's a really beautiful feeling. Thank you so much for putting us together. I think that a lot of what Joseph, Dr. Palis has presented is going to dovetail so nice with the little bit that I'll present, because what Joseph has done is provided a lot of really great examples of mapping, of dominant mapping, of imperialism, and also of more resistance, transgressive type of mapping to try to figure out, as you know, what can we do to in the face of a world that is so unjust and so full of death and destruction. What is it that we can do? And so he brought a lot of really beautiful and inspiring examples. And what I'd like to do is give a little bit more of an abstract understanding that I've developed in the last few years in terms of the work that maps do in terms of how we understand the world, and point out that the ways that we understand space have a lot to do with the types of politics that we adopt and the types of worldviews and ways that we relate to each other and to Mama Earth. This question of human state making in the natural world, I think, is a really great question. And I think I'll try to pop it out here. And so what I'll do is I'll present a little bit of what I've already presented with the University of the Philippines in May on my work with Palestine, and but focusing a little bit less on Palestine and more just on the question of empire, which I think isn't done enough, especially when we talk about Palestine. Usually it's about just Zionism and not so much about empire. So what I'll do is if any of y'all saw me at Dr. Palis's hosted talk back in May, some of this will look familiar to you. If not, it might be new to you. And either way, I'd love to know what kinds of thoughts, ideas it might spark, and then what kinds of conversations we might have. So I'll try to keep it as short as I can so we can have more discussion. So I'll start sharing my screen, and what I'm going to share, I think I'm going to venture into the more careful sharing, or maybe not. Let's see if my screen ends up messing up. So here we go. Here we are. Okay. Y'all can see this black map, yes, with the green line?
Yes.
Great. So in my work, I focus a lot on the work that maps do in the world. And when I talk about the world, I talk about the world built by 1492, which has become the dominant world. It's a world that has the globe adopting a lot of European values in terms of economy and society, religion, spirituality, culture. And it's a world that is very dominant, and it's a world that sadly wants to be the only world that exists. There are many worlds that continue to exist, even in spite of that. Yet it has come at a great cost in terms of there have been other worlds that have been extinguished, and so like the genocides of so many of the worlds of the Americas, of Native America, was the extinction of worlds so that one world can be imposed, and that world wouldn't have any competitors or alternatives. And if there were alternatives, or if there are alternatives that make themselves known, then the dominant world will tell us that, well, those worlds are backward, or they're primitive, they haven't caught up to us. Like we are the epitome of what human history should be like, according to the dominant world, which comes out of Western Europe and then is imposed on the globe. And so I'd like to start with this map. And it's a map of the line that was cut by the Pope Alexander, only 2 years after Columbus sailed and let Europe know that there's this whole other continent, which he didn't know of at first, but later it was, of course, understood. And what had happened with those quote unquote discoveries is that Portugal was already in Africa with slave trade and colonization, and it was very interested in these new discoveries. But there was a Spanish crown that had taken credit for the discoveries, financed Columbus. And so very, very quickly, the Portuguese and the Spanish started to fight over who was going to get what. And the Pope stepped in because the Pope was a bit upset at how, well, we can't have two Catholic countries fighting, so let's agree on something. And what came out of that agreement were these cuts. This green line, the Treaty of Tortoise in 1494 said, okay, Spain, anything west of this line, go ahead, it's yours. You have the dominion, it's your dominion to convert to Catholicism for the salvation of all of those souls. And anything east of that line, well, Portugal, you go ahead and have it. You go ahead and that'll be your mandate. And this is a reason why in Africa, there is Portuguese colonization. And in the little bit of South America over at the eastern bit, there is Brazil that speaks Portuguese. And then over on the west, it's largely Spanish speaking. You also get the Treaty of Zaragoza a few decades later, because as they start to circumnavigate the globe, they're like, oh, so, okay, so it's a globe. So that means we need to have a stopping point. You said the Spanish could conquer anything west of that line. Well, if you keep going west and you end up east. And so then they created a line for the other side of the globe that would make it so, okay, this is where the Spanish can stop. And you can see, and it's so beautiful to talk to folks in the Philippines, because you're part of this story. As you can see, the Philippines would be part of Portugal in this domain, this map that was carved out between the great powers. Except that the Philippines were, of course, colonized by the Spanish, and that's because when it came down to it, little by little, as the Spanish were encroaching more toward the Pacific and Asia, what they ended up thinking was, well, we're just going to go ahead and colonize the Philippines, because what the Portuguese really wanted, the spices, and they just won't be that mad if we take the Philippines, because they really want these other more spice-heavy areas of South Asia. So this I show just to point out the importance of it, not in terms of that they were actually able to make a map. They didn't know the world that's in the background, the land masses, those weren't yet explored fully. What was important is the idea that you could cut the globe, that there was a globe, first of all, and that you could cut it and divide it up as objects of property, which was fairly new in terms of, one, the idea that there's a globe. So it's like this whole new consciousness. What's important about 1492 is it's this massive rupture of consciousness in terms of how we understand each other, the world, our place in the universe. It's when, the Earth stops becoming the center of the universe and understood that the sun is the center of a solar system that the Earth rotates around. So these are all these ruptures that are going on at this time, and we're living the consequences of them, and they're still going on. So if I were to change slides here, you'll see the areas that Brazil colonized from that global linear thinking, and then you'll see here the parts that Spain colonized from that global linear thinking in blue. And the work that I do is very critical of borders. I didn't know growing up that borders were fairly new, that these maps were fairly new. I thought that they had been just naturally there always, which to me I find absurd now, but I didn't before, because that's what we're not taught to be critical in the schools here in the United States. We're not taught to question. You're just taught to absorb. And so in my work, what I did was I wanted to find the history of some borders. And it was pretty liberating in a sense that when you learn history, you learn that the way that the world is created came through a lot of struggle, resistance, and it didn't have to be this way, which means that it could have been another way, which means that it can still continue being another way. And the area that I studied when I was in graduate school with Joseph was the Middle East and North Africa. This is it, circa 2000. And I was fascinated to find that before all of those borders, there was the Ottoman Empire, which you hear a lot about, which I heard a lot about, but I didn't know very much about. And the Ottoman Empire existed before there were these nation states. It is here in the 1800s. Here you can see what its extent, and its extent included not just land, but was really important were the seas, which is something that Dr. Palis was also pointing to in terms of island archipelagos. It's not really just the landmass that's key, it's the control of the seas and what the land masses allow in terms of that control. And that's the area that zooming into that I did a lot of my work in, which is where Palestine is. And this is in 1923, Palestine gets its borders. These borders didn't exist before. Of course, there were people living there, but they understood their geography very different. It was under Ottoman rule. It wasn't nation state. There was a lot of autonomy that was given in terms of like village life. It seems to resemble a little bit of the feudal system of Europe in terms of that there were, the Ottoman Empire made it so that everyone living in their empire had to give tribute and also had to conscript their older sons into the military. So it was similar in that way. And what was fascinating though was that there was a lot of movement across what is now Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. There was a lot of movement, but the imposition of these borders, which was a new way to organize societies in terms of a nation state, this really cut off a lot of the circulation of a lot of these networks. So here, just pointing to the importance of the seas, back to this question of the seas. The Eastern question of the 19th century, that was the question that Europe had about the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire had been at its great height in the 15th, 16th centuries. And then as Europe started to grow through its colonial misadventures, it started to grow more. And what ended up happening is that it beat out the Ottoman Empire in terms of power, but the Ottoman Empire still had control of all of these territories. And so because the Ottoman Empire was weakening by this time, by the 19th century, around 1800, let's say, there's a question in Europe over, hey, who's going to get all that territory when the Ottoman Empire falls? Because remember, Europe has been built now through this question of grabbing territory and understanding it as an object of ownership. And they're very worried about this question because it would completely change the balance of power at the time in Europe if a country that was not Great Britain, which was already the superpower, if Germany were to get these territories, or Russia or France, it would really upset that imbalance of power. And so there were a lot of interest in seeing either the Ottoman Empire stay as is, sickly and weak, or to see the Ottoman Empire fall so that the territories can be divvied up by the Europeans. And so here, what becomes important about this specific territory is the Black Sea and the Red Sea. The Black Sea is important because if you're Russia, you need, and you're in shipping, and you're part of shipping and maritime voyage, you need seas. And the Black Sea is the only body of water that is close to Russia that has a year-round warm water port, because the rest of the seas up north, they freeze. And so in order to use the Black Sea and cross it, the Russians would always need permission from the Ottoman Empire, because the straits that connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea were part of the Ottoman Empire territory. And so Russia really wanted the Ottoman territories. Over in the Red Sea, between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, there were ideas, especially from Napoleon, hey, we should cut a canal over there because then we can create this shortcut so that we can travel over to India, especially the crown jewel of British colonialism, take that colony from Britain, and then we'll be more powerful. And so then that's exactly what happens. Napoleon, in addition to fighting within Europe, here's the trail of Napoleon's, all of his wars. In addition to belligerence internally to Europe, also takes a voyage over to Cairo, or at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you see the pyramids in Cairo in 1798. And he takes a lot of scientists with him, not just soldiers, and creates an Encyclopedia of Egypt, which is a description of Egypt. It's a very famous encyclopedia that has maps, and it also has sketches of pyramids and the flora and the fauna. And it was a sensation for the West, for Western Europe, and for the United States and Canada, because it was the first time since the Crusades that Western Europeans had been able to go to the quote unquote Holy Land, even if Napoleon himself wasn't really, the regime wasn't so much about like a crusade. Still, it was very important for lots of folks that Europeans were able to go there. And so it was a sensation. And in that book, you see maps. And you see maps mostly of Egypt, but within the coastline of the Eastern Mediterranean, you get some of Palestine. So there, I've transposed Palestine on there. And so that's what I did. I wanted to look at Palestine, like, hey, how did Palestine get its modern map? And what does that mean for struggle, for an anti-colonial struggle? Because if you're in the movement, if you accompany the Palestinian movement, you use maps all of the time to tell the story. And they're very important tools, very powerful tools to tell the story of colonialism, but we don't really question where those maps came from and what conceptions of space we might be replicating, adopting by using those maps so much without questioning that space. That's just one representation of space. There are many possible representations of space, as we saw with Dr. Palis's presentation. Here I have this map here of when Palestine first starts to get its borders. After Napoleon's expedition, you get a lot of biblical scholars from the West, and they want to prove their own version of Christianity as valid scientifically by mapping out the promised land of the Hebrew Bible. And you start getting this. I can say a lot more about this, but at the same time, later, actually, after you get that map, a few decades later, the Ottoman Empire ends up falling during the First World War. And a big reason for that is because the local population was able to rally against it in alliance with the European powers, who promised them, hey, you're going to get your nation state and your freedom if you align with us. Yet at the same time, the great powers in secret were agreeing to how they were going to cut up these territories. So here you get a map that was leaked. After the Russian Empire fell to the Bolsheviks leaked this map and showed that the Russian Empire was conspiring with the British and the French and to make it so that these territories would be colonized, even though colonialism, because of so much resistance, was already getting a bad rap, and people didn't like to use that term. They talk about, well, we're going to put it under protection. That had already happened with Africa, the cutting up of land and giving it away to European powers, the great scramble for Africa in the late 1800s. You see here France, England, Italy, Spain, Belgium, famously with the Congo, Germany, Portugal. And very famously here is Cecil Rhodes, who colonized Southern Africa, standing, from Cairo to Cape Town. He says all of this will be British. And Rhodes scholars are named after this person. The Rhodesia was named after this person until it was changed to Zimbabwe. Uh, and there's still, statues of this person all over the place, very, very much venerated. And I want to point to how even before the scramble for Africa, a century before, there was already the cutting up, even more concretely, of the Americas between the Spanish and the Portuguese. And of course, the British got in on the game. And of course, there was the French there, especially in Haiti. And so I'm just gonna go really quickly on this, and then I'll wrap up so we can do some Q&A, so maybe 5 more minutes, if that's okay, moderators? Yeah, cool. So in doing all of this research, I wanted to understand a lot, what is the logic? What is the logic of this idea that you can cut up the world and think that you own it? And you really believe that you own it. And you don't care about the people living there or taking them into account. And the logic that I've been zoning in on and trying to uncover about the world built by 1492 is it's actually not difficult to find, because if you just read the jurists, the Spanish jurists and the political philosophers that came, especially from Spain, as these questions were being addressed over what to do with these new quote unquote discoveries, and then just the way that European philosophy, political philosophy has developed and continues still, there is a pattern that exists, a pattern of thought that's really important to look at that exists in European philosophy, in Western philosophy. And it's the idea that all differences need to be ranked on a scale of superior or inferior. So there isn't, so like skin color, for example, we can't all just be different skin colors or look different. No, under Western philosophy, all differences have to be ranked according to beauty and ugliness, superiority, inferiority, people who deserve to be alive, people who don't really deserve to be that much alive. Everything is ranked. Almost everything. There are little bits like rainbows. Like if we can stop and appreciate a rainbow, we understand that all of those colors are necessary to complement each other in order to create this amazingness that is a rainbow. And I think it's not at all a coincidence that the queer movement talks about or has a symbol of a rainbow. And like Joseph said, being queer it's not strictly about sexuality. Being queer is being outside of this framework that I'm about to show you somewhere. This framework is very binary, meaning that you're either this or you're either that, and it aspires toward binarism. It aspires not fluidity, not complementarity, but binarism, meaning that you're either this or you're this, and one is superior than the other. And so then the idea, there was this cut of the world of 1492 with the Treaty of Tordesillas, but that cut was a cut between Europeans. So the idea of the world of 1492 is that there is a Europe that is important and then a non-Europe that isn't as important. And so the idea too of 1492 that is very prominent is
Hello, Matt.
She may be
I think she's not
lagged or frozen.
I think just wait for a while.
Yeah, so I think Dr. Kikiviks experienced technical difficulties. For the meantime, we're
There.
inviting our audience.
She's
Okay.
back. She's back.
He's back. He's back.
Mhm. Make her as a co-host so she could share them.
Hi, I didn't even know I froze until I heard y'all asking if I was okay. All right, cool. So I maybe just so that I can wrap up in a couple minutes, I just won't share the PowerPoint. I can just use my hands really fast, and then we can just keep talking, if that's okay. So you get the cut of the world between European powers, but there's a greater cut that takes place in the mind. And that is the cut that there's a Europe and then there's non-Europe. And Europe is going to be a space of peace because it's been at war and we want to create a nice life. And all of our violence, we're going to export over to non-Europe. So the creation of international law arises following 1492 and its idea that we need to create Europe as a peaceful place. But the international law does not apply to anything outside of Europe. So there can be piracy among European powers. They can steal their stuff, but just don't bring that over here. There's war, of course, that still takes place within European powers, but there are laws of war. Whereas in non-Europe, there are no laws of war. Anything goes. And Europe has still a tendency to export out its problems. So for example, you get the rise of capitalism, which meant the dispossession of people from the land so that they can become factory workers, and there's a lot of resistance. Well, how do you solve a resistance problem like that if you're the English crown? You just tell people, hey, look, there's all this land over there in the New World, in Australia, these new discoveries. Why don't you go get that land for us, and so that it deputizes people that have been in struggle in order to continue imperialism. And so that's something that I look at a lot, is the question that really inspires me is in doing the work of Israel-Palestine and seeing that Jews who have been victims, incredibly persecuted victims of empire, now become part of empire so that they can survive through the state of Israel, through Zionism. And so a question that I worry about all of the time is, in all of our movements, basically, how do we not become the monsters that we are struggling against? How do we not become Israelis who had been the wretched of the earth and are now the wretched of empire? And so then there's this logic at play. If we don't critique this logic that says, well, the world that exists, you're either part of the peace, or you're part of the war, you're part of Europe, or you're part of non-Europe, or you're part of this universal humanity, human rights, the United Nations, or you're not part of that, and you're a terrorist, and you're a non-human. And so what a lot of us do who are stuck in the non-human category, classified as that, as non-human, as wretched, a lot of the time, sadly, what we choose to do is ask our oppressors, can we please survive? And the way that we do that is we try to make ourselves useful to them. And so then the big question then that I think that maybe we could consider more is, how do we organize away from that? How do we exit this whole binary superior inferior logic that we have and create another world? And in order to do that, we create worlds. We have to figure out the material conditions for our survival, because the dominant world is very much intertwined with removing us from Mother Earth. Means that we just have our labor power to sell, and so everything that we need to survive has to be bought. And so we're selling our labor power, but when nobody's buying our labor power, what happens? And also, like, just the ethics of selling our labor power in order to survive is something that we don't really talk too much about. So I'll leave it at that, and I'd be happy to show other maps if there are questions about it in Q&A, about other ways of making space, about counter cartography, and because I'm really more interested in what this might spark from you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kikiviks, for that very comprehensive and insightful discussion. Having Palestine being shed into light is much timely and relevant. I really find the discussion to be very interesting, especially on the concept of dominant and primitive worlds. How about you, Kirsten?
What I learned from this talk, first and foremost, it was really agitating to learn that from this talk, imperialism is really the highest degree, the largest scale of accumulation through dispossession. And we talk about imperialism and colonialism as if it were a distant past, but it's happening right now, and it's still persisting. And as as Dr. Kikiviks said, the Palestinian struggle is not merely a conflict between two opposing forces, but rather it's an imperialist back process that has displaced millions of Palestinians in pursuit of land and resources. And from that, we ought to wonder what alternative world is happening, what alternative world is waiting for us out there, and what can we do to further the struggle towards it. So thank you very much for that really, really comprehensible talk on imperialism, on the history of imperialism. So with that, we are now opening the floor for questions from the audience. So please feel free to send in your questions or clarifications in the Zoom chat box or in the Facebook live stream. And to those who would like to unmute, you can also message us so that we can include you in our queuing system. I'll wait. Okay, so while waiting for questions, I've been seeing a lot of manifestations on our Twitter page. People are saying that they want to shift to geography course now. They really appreciated this talk. And
we have for those of you who are interested, seriously, if you're interested, we have an MS Geography program at UP Diliman. And well, we already finished with our application, but for next semester, application is ongoing right now until about November. So if you're interested in talk more about this, we have lots of these types of talk.
I'm really looking forward to shifting to the department.
Welcome, Kirsten. I do want to say something while we're waiting for some question that I think Dr. Kikiviks, the first time she introduced this in the counter mapping class where she was asked as a guest to come, that really sort of galvanized the class and those people who were listening to it was a take off from the idea that the conflict or the binarism is not just about the killing or extermination of certain people, because that comes as an offshoot, but it's kind of a thinking, right? The kind of thinking that there is really, that is the border, right? That is really what separates this, much more than any physical or geographical or environmental borders that happen. Because in geography, I remember, when I was an undergrad student, I remember asking this question and I didn't get a satisfying answer. And I don't know, maybe critical cartography was not quite understood as it was now. But I was asking the question, so if Europe and Asia are different, are belong to the same continent, why can't we call it Eurasia? And then I said, you should give me a concrete example why we should separate Europe and Asia. And our professor said something like, well, there's a Ural Mountains, URAL, like the Ural Mountains. I know, right? The Ural Mountains separate the Europe and Asia. And I said, that's your geographical answer, Joseph. So I was satisfied with that. I said, okay, so it's the Ural Mountain. It doesn't even extend to the south. It doesn't matter. That's what it is. And I don't know, Kiki, maybe you can say something a little bit more about that too.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. Europe makes up all kinds of stuff about itself. LOL. Yeah, it's a huge question because when we think of continents, we think of land masses that are on their own. And so Africa, the Americas, Australia, and then there's Europe and Asia, which are really just one landmass. And it's those are the kinds of questions that are so cool to be able to answer in a critical geography class. So just a warning, if you want to be a geographer, not everyone is as cool and open and critical. Geography is very big. But the really great thing is that if you do human geography, which is like the focus on like anthropology, social science, politics and stuff, you cannot get away from the more radical critical geographers like Joseph and me, because we're a force. So whether you like what we're saying or not, you still have to learn about it. And that's pretty cool about geography, I think.
I do have to say that when you spoke last May, Kiki, my own students thought, oh, she's very biased, and she was so anti-Israel the whole time. So, I mean, those are conversations that we are ready to answer to, and it's not at all like, oh, let's celebrate this without quite understanding the bigger picture, because there's a space where those kinds of thinking come from, right? And also, let me just say this, Mode, if while we're still having questions about the thing about the island and archipelago studies, is try to imagine it this way: islands and archipelagos are extensions of the oceans, not the other way around. Wherein the ocean is just there, right? That needs to be, I don't know, create some kind of infrastructure so that you can create those stuff right there. But more on the idea that the oceans are the ones that really provide for these kinds of interconnectivities. And to understand people is to understand the ocean. That's why Kamau Brathwaite, Kirsten, you may be interested to check him out. He is a Caribbean poet and writer who did tidal dialectics. Was actually the guy who said something about to understand it is to go submarine, right? Submarine, below it, because that's the way to understand interconnection. So islands are configurations, yes, but they're not the ones that you see and say, oh, look at the island in the beautiful sea. It should be the other way around. But it changes our cartographic imagination. It's the same way that when we use, for example, the map, the Mercator map, for example, of the world. It's used by it's a colonial map that was used to show you navigation, pretty much, right? But some people are now saying we should use the Peters projection, which is just gonna mess up people's cartographic imagination. So, and you imagine this: I gave a talk. I gave a talk once to a group of high school students. This was before the pandemic, and I was talking about these kinds of maps, and all that. And then one student actually raised her hand, and I'm so sorry that I broke her heart when I answered her when she said something like. So what is the correct map that we should be using? Correct, the word correct is, of course, very subjective, right? I don't know. How would I know what correct means? I know what is correct to me, but it may not be correct for the others. So I can suggest ways for you. But I said something like, well, it depends. What do you want to know? Place names? Mercator can do that, but be aware of the politics behind it, right? Do you want to see the world not from the perspective of the European? Look for the equal area projection, right? Look at other kinds of map projections that were done by people in order to show you a different sense of the world rather than the one that's north south and all these kinds of configurations. So it has that conundrum. And there is a question here, if you don't mind, real quick, by Carl. What's the correct? Correct. Come on, Carl. We can't do that. But let me just tell you what I think. First of all, the definition of the archipelago is always seen as the unity of the groups of islands into one. Right, so the Philippines, and believe it or not, the U.S. is an archipelago because of Hawaii and Alaska, right? So we don't think of it about that way, because it's always just the 48 states that we look at. So in this particular sense, when we look at the archipelago, is to approach it not so much as a given, right? But to even question the definition why it is called archipelago in the first place, because even the islands in the Philippines, especially though, and some of us here are familiar with this, but even certain kinds of groups of island wanted to secede from the Philippines because of a different kind of narrative or imagination. So that's that. But the standard definition given is the unity of islands and islands, people, water to come together for the archipelago. I don't want to disabuse that, but there's a lot of archipelagic definition. Thinking with the archipelago are some of the new innovations that are given, wherein they try to even not provide definition, but to provide lives of people that experience it. So I'm sorry, Carl, I really disappointed you by not giving you a definition, but the key is to look at the ocean, the dialectics of the tides, much more than the configuration.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sir Palis. That was really insightful. You have a lot to synthesize from those answers, but I think Carl's question was fulfilled naman. So the next question to our speakers, to both our speakers, is how do we locate spaces of resistance within the sphere of map making and research without necessarily being limited by the constraints of the academy? So who wants to go first? Doctor.
Sure, I'm happy to. This is a great question. Locating spaces of resistance without being limited by the constraints of academe. So the question of being of the constraints of academe. So there's intellectual work, there's study, there's learning, there's education, and none of that has to be academia. Academia has that, and what academia does is it lives within a world of rules and ways of doing things. And those rules or that knowledge can only be produced by people with titles. And if it's published and it's scientific, it has to be scientific, meaning that it's replicable. Unless it's like philosophy theory, then it has to be specific kind of rational. There's definitions of what philosophy is. And it has to be peer review. So then the people that you're accountable to are other academics. So if you're working outside of academia and then bringing it into academia, then there's already like this really weird relationship that you're in, because if you're working with spaces of resistance outside of academia and then bringing it into academia, that's a really interesting navigation that has to take place to actually be accountable to those spaces of resistance and to also see yourself as part of resistance, which academia also doesn't really like academics to do. Academics are supposed to be separate from the world, not have thoughts, ideas, biases. And so then doing things, which is not possible. And even journalists themselves say objectivity, this doesn't make any sense. It doesn't exist. It's impossible, which is actually a very colonial idea that you could actually be separate from the world and then talk about the world. I mean, this is this colonial cartography we're talking about. It's a God's eye view of the world as if like you're separate from it and you can own it. And so then how do we locate those spaces? The spaces are there. And the thing is that I think the challenge is on those of us who've been trained to think of geography as what geographers do, as what professionals do, and learn to see how people make space all of the time. I have an example of very, very quickly, if I may, and I'll just skip through these slides just to locate it. So a refugee camp that I helped map, they asked me to map it after we had discussions about how dangerous it is to map. This is a refugee camp. And here's the aerial photo. And it's a refugee camp in Palestine that is right adjacent to the apartheid wall. So if you're standing on top of a tall building in the refugee camp, this is the view you get, the wall, and then there's an olive orchard behind the wall that was taken away from access from the refugee camp. And so I was asked to make this map of the refugee camp, and I started to trace it from this aerial photograph, and I started to show a friend there who asked me to make a map. I was like, hey, are my streets okay? And this is the streets, and he looks, he's like, yeah, they're great, but you know, the rooftops are also streets. And so I asked him to draw that, and this is rooftops as streets. And so this is an example that I really like to show about how people create space all of the time. And in this case, Nadal, who made this map, he had to use the rooftops as streets while they were under curfew by the Israeli military. And that allowed him and others to pass information, to pass food, to go visit neighbors while they couldn't use the actual streets. And it's something that I, as a professional cartographer, wouldn't know about, because to me, those aren't streets. Like, to me, the streets are streets. But if you're actually from the camp, if you're from there, you know that space so well, you actually don't even need a map. The reason why they needed a map was for in order for water issues to be alleviated by some water folks, and that actually did happen. But that's the reason why, but they themselves know the map very well in ways that outsiders like myself wouldn't be able to really talk about or to show or to map. And so all that to say, just as an example of that, these other spaces are everywhere. We just need to learn to look and to listen. And it's something that I had to learn to do and learn it, especially away from my university training in international studies, which might be global studies now. But the idea being that if you're from a Western university like UNC Chapel Hill, which is an elite public school, and if you're going to go do work internationally, then it's already assumed that you know more than anyone else outside of the United States. And so then you need to tell people what to do. And so that's the way that we're raised in the university system in the United States. And so it takes a lot of unlearning that to actually be in relation with dignity with people anywhere in the world. And then once you can do that, then you can start seeing that these spaces are everywhere. We just need to learn to see, we need to learn to listen. And it takes a lot of unlearning of other ways and learning of new ways.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kikiviks, for that very insightful answer to the question. Okay, now let's move on to the third question. It was answered already by Dr. Palis in the comment section, but we'll still bring it up. So from NJ, I would like to ask on how we can bring geography closer to the masses.
Who would want to go first?
Sorry, I was responding to David. I was looking for that FB page. I'll give it to you, David, in a minute. What I said here, MJ, that's a wonderful question. What I said here in the chat box, something about making it less academic and much more people-centered, and they can do maps on their own. I do have to say one thing real quick. I have this colleague, right, from the American Association of Geographers, and she's very kind of condescending, really. She said to me one time, she teaches digital cartography, and she said, "Oh, I tell my students just because they can make maps doesn't mean they should. Some of their maps are really, expletive, pretty much." And I said something like, "Some of these people may be doing maps for the first time. This is their area of creating a map that they must have looked at for the first time. I think you should encourage it." So I always use that quote that she gave me in a positive way and saying something like, everyone should be making a map, right? Make your own map, personal maps, community maps, all kinds of wild imaginings of your area, especially now in the pandemic world we're in, of how we can ignite change, in small little ways. And it has been a lot of efforts that were being done about it. So to go back to that, MJ, to that question, we do that. We do these kinds of service. We reach out. We provide talks, but that's only as far as we can go. Then we have colleagues such as Oni Martinez, and I'm sure David is one of them too, who did these kinds of really more immersion, people-centered kind of mapping that really generate information gathered from people from other and create maps that are more lived in, right? So it doesn't have to require you to be technically proficient in cartography or GIS for that matter, but it helps if you're also to do that, to subvert the rules and the languages of GIS in order to create your own map. But anyone could really do that. But just be warned also that there is a kind of responsibility that comes with knowing a technology or knowing something from the maps knowledge, right? Because I don't know what movie I get this from, that comes with certain responsibility. Must be Spider-Man, but something like it really generates that kind of thing. So yeah, I leave it there.
How about Dr. Kikiviks?
That's such a great question. How to bring to the masses. And I can speak from the United States perspective more than anything, because it's what I know and how I grew up. In the United States, I think that's really important, because the United States very famously is not very good at geography in terms of school, what's learned in school. It's mostly just like one like when you're maybe 11 years old, you learn about the capitals of the United States, and that's all your geography is. And so then when it comes to all of these wars, like in the Middle East, what people can't even point to is the map and tell you where Iraq is or Afghanistan, and even the president can't do that. It's a huge problem, and it's something that geographers seem to talk about. We recognize it. I don't know if we do enough about it, but we try, and for sure we recognize it. I can give an example of how in my geography I've had ideas for this, and this is going to take me winning the lottery or getting a massive cash infusion. So whoever's listening, please be welcome. It would be to I do farming. I work a lot with agriculture, and a friend and I have an idea to get magically access to steward lots of land with hills. And create demonstration farming practices there. So part of it would be a recreation of Palestinian terraces, and also Palestinian rain-fed agriculture, how that works, how the soil is prepared. Another section would be for Mesoamerican milpa, which is the three sisters, which is the corn, beans, and squash, and how they grow together in this complementary way. Another would be a native Chumash people's food forest, because in the geography that I'm from in California, there was no agriculture, it was hunter-gatherer. So then how does that work, you know? To have these as demonstrations and to have little sections have demonstrations of farming practices all over the world that can help us with questions like with climate change and resilience and drought and all of these challenges that we have, while having people themselves from these countries, many of who are in the United States, and nobody's asking them about their knowledges about agriculture. They're working as taxi drivers or in industrial agriculture, and having them be residents, like artists in residence who are farming and can teach us about these practices, and also the challenges of transplanting them over to California, because maybe the soil isn't the same, or the weather, obviously. And it would be like a way for people to have the world come to them rather than having to travel the world, which is impossible for so many people, especially in the geography that I'm from. And so it's this, rather than telling people, hey, you have to learn about geography, you need to learn about the Middle East, you need to learn about Africa or whatever geography it is, making it interesting in a way that makes it relevant to their lives. And especially when it comes to agriculture and doing a lot of farm-based education with people who have a lot of trauma with agriculture, who don't want anything to do with Black people, don't want, from the history of plantation slavery in the United States, a lot of children like myself of undocumented migrants who come from a community of industrial agriculture don't want anything to do with agriculture. But it's this way that when we can be with land in a very different way, in a more dignified, respectful way, there's serious spiritual reckonings that take place in terms of how we understand the world, how we, like, what we understand life and death to be. Especially there's a lot of death in agriculture, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a regenerative thing. So anyway, it allows us to really philosophize. And so that's an example of learning about agriculture from other geographies. It really is learning about their worlds, their worldviews, their philosophies, their metaphysics, and their histories and cultures. And so that's an example. And that this is a massive project that I'm thinking about, but we've done little bits of it through seed saving and exchange and giving away and telling stories of seeds. That can happen if anyone just has a little plot of a garden in the backyard or anything like that on the porch. So that's just a concrete example of what your question made me think about.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kikiviks and Dr. Palis, for your very insightful response. I believe that both were able to answer MJ's question. Now, let's read the fourth question from the audience. For both speakers, I'd like to ask the speakers about their thoughts on Mercator projection, and if there are other forms or kinds of projection that are less Western or European.
So the Mercator projection is is a very great projection for distance. And but then what it does is it centers Europe in a way that makes it so that if you look at that map, and that's really the main map, the only map that you see, then you start to think that Europe and Greenland are massive, and Africa and South America are very small. And so with that map, what I would say, that map is, like all maps, like what is the right map? The right map is the one that's helpful to you, to whatever problem you have, that it's a tool, and if it's, and it can be helpful for the colonizer, and it can be helpful for the resistance movement. It can be helpful for the oppressor and the oppressed, but it all depends on how we deploy it. So there are other maps. There's the Peters map that shows size, but then it distorts the ways that we understand land shapes to be. And that was very much a political kind of a resistance counter map to show, hey, this map is just as good as the Mercator in terms of showing truth, but the truth that it focuses on is land mass size, whereas the Mercator one focuses on navigational distance. And if we can talk about maps in that way, then I think it's more helpful. The problem becomes though that we get a set of maps that are imposed all the time, and then we don't think critically about them, or we don't understand them as just tools. We think of them as just, that's just the way the world is. That's the problem that I see.
And thank you very much, Dr. Kikiviks. Dr. Palis, would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, sure. And I'm so glad to see you said, so many familiar people here. So happy. Said, can I say this? Said actually took my class before, and he's wonderful in that counter mapping class. And how can we prevent ourselves from fetishizing counter mapping almost everything in relation to liberation struggles or social movements? So wonderful to hear that. One of the things I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to use this as an example, is that there is a danger, especially when counter maps are used to perpetuate the status quo or certain kinds of neoliberal ideology. Not that they're bad necessarily, but as much as they exploit people. It's just like sorry if I digress a little bit. It's just like my students, when they ask me questions, so sir, is capitalism really bad? Well, look at the practices that exploit people, especially that one, the unequal distribution, the disparity that comes with it. But, because it promotes that kind of human, a kind of personal gain much more than a collective. So yes, said, it is definitely, I said that before earlier, that we can be critical of counter mapping too, as that, because it has the danger, like what Kiki has mentioned earlier. It has the danger of become the go-to map of people that becomes exploitative in its own way, right? Just like that story about Israel being the wretched of the earth become the wretched of the one that's now in power, when you look at in relation to this other nations. So there is that. And I think the caveat of looking at counter mapping or counter cartography as not the gospel truth, but something that should invite the fertile mind to enrich themselves by creating world-making activities in their own terms, is probably the one that matter most. So for example, said, I'm sorry, I'm gonna out you with this one, but said actually together with two other cartographers in my class did a map that's interactive. It's about smell, it's about travel, and it's one comes from Cavite, one comes from UP campus, one comes from Tanagsara, but it's their own engagement with the environment really, and it shows you that one who comes from Cavite, it's time lapse, by the way. It just try to imagine it. It's time lapse, and it had to be only 3 minutes. So the landscapes just whiz by, but along the way you get to see certain kinds of practices or people that were in it, and it's a beautiful peek at how things are done in this country, for better or for worse. And also the smellscape map is wonderful map that tells you also their engagement with the more olfactory sensations, if you may call it that. To the environment where they're in, and from food to droppings to manure to all kinds of things that interact with your senses are really fascinating ways of looking at the world or your environment in fresh new ways. So, but Kiki, you may want to answer that question too, or
Yeah, I think it's a great question in terms of, yeah, a lot of geographers joined up in a lot of resistance movements, indigenous movements to countermap, to help countermap, to basically to tell counter stories using the tools of the colonizer, which can be very controversial, but it's also very interesting to think about. And what they found is that in most instances, what happened is that Native peoples would use these maps, pardon, make claims to territory that they owned it, and they'd use it in court. And what ended up happening is that they actually believed that Mama Earth is an object of property, of ownership, but of them as Native people, even if when, before colonization, Mama Earth was not understood as an object of property. So what happens a lot of the time with counter mapping is that if it doesn't have a different kind of ideology from the dominant world, then it's just going to replicate the dominant world's ideology and destroy resistance movements in terms of consciousness, where they believe that, well, we're in resistance, and they believe that means, well, that means that we need to survive. And it hasn't really been thought through, like, survive how, because I think a lot of us are in this question of how do we survive? Well, how means we'll survive at the expense of other people, which has been what the Puritans did in the United States and what a lot of settlers did all over the world who were being persecuted in England or other parts of Europe, and like the Dutch in South Africa. And they thought about their question of survival, but then that question wasn't about how do we survive together with the indigenous peoples that they went to go live, not with, but on top of. Instead, it was, how do I survive? So these questions really need to be integral, deep, profound in terms of resistance movements. And a lot of the times, because we're really just trying to survive, we're just trying to survive. And so then we end up moving in ways that might allow us to survive just me or my family or my small community, but it'll come at the expense of others, or it won't even work, because the only reason empire will allow you to survive, if it doesn't just allow you to die, is if you can make yourself useful to it. So then the question is, how do we think of some other way? I don't want to be useful to empire. I don't want to step on other people in order to survive. How do we get out of this logic? And so then I think if we have a plan to get out of that logic, then that will determine what maps we use. Is this map going to make us stronger the day after? Is it going to make us weaker the day after? So always strategically using the map, and never saying, I'm never going to use this tool or that. No, like whatever tool, just in context. What is the context of that tool's usage? And I don't think that a lot of our movements think in that way. But I think that we absolutely can, and I think that we really need to, in order to really create a different world than the one that we're just forced to live under, that we ourselves then reproduce by accepting its terms and conditions, and then not understanding the significance of other worlds, and then no longer even being able to see those other worlds.
Again, thank you, Dr. Kikiviks and Dr. Palis, for answering the question. But due to time constraints, that would be our last question. If the audience have any more questions, you may reach out to the social media accounts of INS, and we'll be coordinating the questions to these speakers. Again, thank you very much to our dear speakers, Dr. Palis and Dr. Kikiviks, for imparting invaluable insights in today's event. Emancipatory politics will always be tied to the issue of space, who dominates it, and who is being dominated. Critical geography and its methodologies allows us to perceive and navigate spaces and politics from below, coupled with studying the history and development of imperialism.
To add to that, critical geography is also, in a way, tied to viewing the world from a historical or dialectical materialist perception. And through this lens, we can see how a lot of struggles, a lot of international struggles right now is not isolated to the topic of space and place. Lumads from Bakwit schools are recounting and visualizing their narratives in the form of maps. Displaced farmers from all over the world are marking their places in the struggle for land. And we also saw how Palestinians are making maps as a political strategy and a form of resistance. So, in a time where imperialism continues to plague our lands, it is justified that we go outside and expand our spaces of struggle instead of replicating colonialist prescriptions. So, again, thank you so much for our speakers.
Thank you, speakers. Now we would also like to thank. Ayan. Now we would also like to thank our partner organizations for making this event possible. Sociosphere UPB, Sakbayan UPLB, Gabriela Youth PLM, and to our media partner UPLB Perspective.
Now, to our dear audience, we would also love to hear what you think about the event. So please head on to the link that will be sent out in the chat box. So we also would like to present the certificates of appreciation to our speakers. So thank you so much for attending and facilitating this talk today. And here, we'd like to present the certificate of appreciation to Dr. Joseph Palis and Dr. Linda Kikiviks for hosting this talk on anti-imperialist geography given this 27th of July 2021.
Okay. Thank you, speakers. Before formally ending this event, Before formally ending this event, we would like to remind all of you that there will be a mapping workshop today at 4:30 p.m., which will be facilitated by mapmaker Sir David Garcia using the same Zoom room. So interested participants may still remain in the call. Our final event, the Basic Masses Situationer and Solidarity Night, will be on July 31st. This will still be streamed at 8 p.m. on our Facebook page. You may follow our social media accounts for other important announcements. We're also inviting our audience to participate in our raffle event for a chance to win 1,000 pesos. The link to purchase raffle entries will be posted in the chat box. Thank you.
So again, the mapping workshop will be held at 4:30 in the same Zoom room. And to those who are interested in joining the Institute as we continue propagating and advancing a nationalist consciousness, especially under these dire social conditions, you may sign up for an orientation at the link provided below. Once again, thank you all very much for participating in this event. This has been Kirsten.
And this has been Z. See you again in our next events. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can we take a picture?
Yeah. For all the